Hi. So I have a question about the Sudan and maybe the British Empire, this kind of empire we have today. Because I know there was, before the partition of the country, a project of making a railroad connection between Dakar in Senegal and Khartoum in Sudan. That's the conflict we had in this period make the project to be not possible anymore. And this year we had recently, just before the attack of the petroleum infrastructure in the north, we had the Islamic Development Banks that make clear this its intention to support this project of making this railroad connection. So there is clearly a link between the conflicts and this kind of development. And we can say maybe there is some imperial intention to avoid this project to come.
The policy to divide Sudan is a very old policy. I mean, what Michael was saying, Mike Billington, is the British Empire policy is to divide and conquer, and that has not changed. The problem is that we have other forces who are using the same policy. The United States and Europe are playing the same policy of divide and conquer, like this splitting of Sudan, which was first we had a peace process between South and North Sudan to stop the civil war. But when that succeeded, we had a new operation against Sudan, like in Darfur, which was actually a conflict over water. It was not a political conflict, but some genius politicians in Britain and in the United States, and especially Susan Rice, who's the United States UN ambassador, they played a key role in getting the Southern Sudanese to go for secession. The problem is that the peace process in Sudan included one element which said that the people of Southern Sudan will have the right to have a referendum to decide if they want to stay as part of the larger Sudan or split. But there was a massive campaign to support the secessionist movement in Southern Sudan after John Garang was killed in an airplane crash. But the idea is that because they don't want big nations in Africa. Sudan is, as traditionally known, potentially the breadbasket of Africa and the world. Only Sudan, if you develop the water resources of Sudan, you have fertile land. It's like 1.5 million square kilometers. All of Sudan is fertile land. You don't have salty areas like in other regions. So Sudan was potentially, and this is the LaRouche movement have been fighting for many years, that if you develop Sudan, you can secure food for everyone, but you can also secure food for other nations. So they created this split between South and North Sudan, which was originally the British created the split because they never developed Southern Sudan when they occupied Sudan. The British were in Sudan from 1884 to 1956. But Southern Sudan was never developed. They were not interested in Southern Sudan. They were growing cotton in Northern Sudan, in the northern part of Sudan. So they kept the Southern Sudan in a primitive condition. As Ayman says, there is no infrastructure still today. And all the political tactics in Southern Sudan has been around building a political movement in Southern Sudan around the SPLM, the guerrilla group, to make them into a government. But the United States and Europe and the British, they did not help Southern Sudan build a single road all these 10 years. So the intention is not to help these nations, the intention is to break them up. And Southern Sudan could also split into many because there are many different tribes in Southern Sudan. So now there are campaigns in Europe, environmentalists, political groups who support different tribes or minorities, they call them. So the thing with the Port Sudan Dakar railway, this project exists, on the as a plan. The government of Sudan, the government of Chad, and this is very important because Darfur crisis, as I said, this was a water problem because in that region of Sudan and Africa, you have nomadic tribes who travel all over the place to look for water for their animals, and then you have settled farmers. The settled farmers, they have their wells and other sources. But the nomads, they say, according to their tradition, that water is also theirs. So when the drought increased and the water crisis became worse, the nomads started invading the lands of the settled farmers in that region. And that created tribal conflicts. People were killing each other over water. But then somebody came and turned that into a political crisis by saying, well, it's the government of Sudan who's supporting these settled farmers, the Arab tribes, against the African tribes. I mean, if you go to Sudan, you cannot really distinguish. But then they mobilized some of these Darfurian tribes, and actually with a logistics base in Chad, supported by France, by European, the United States, and the British, and also with the massive propaganda. But now that there's a peace process in Darfur, but also the government of Sudan and the government of Chad decided to cooperate, because Chad did not get anything from the British, the United States, or Europe for supporting the war against Sudan. Chad is still a dry, poor country. So the Chad government, they have changed their policy, say, we want to cooperate with Sudan. And therefore, this railway, which goes from Sudan, the Red Sea port, through Chad to West Africa, this is a real project. It exists. And the problem is that there is no financing, there is no support. The problem is that you cannot trust the United States, Europe, for implementing these projects. And you should not involve the United Nations. You know, I am very strongly against the United Nations, because everywhere they go, they take a big project, and they say, like, you have a big project called the Senegalese president invented the name. It's called the African Great Green Wall, like the Chinese Great Green Wall. They want to build a green belt, as I described yesterday, all the way from Senegal through the Sahel region on the border of the desert, all the way to East Africa. It looks very, very impressive. But then you get the United Nations organizations, environmental organizations, and the EU involved, and they turn this massive project, which will take like enormous power and industrialization, and they say, well, we can help people, small farmers, to plant some trees here and there. And then they make a very nice video film of the thing and say, oh, we are building the great green belt of Africa, green wall. You can see it on YouTube. But when you're looking how they are working, what is the capital, what is the technology they are using, is just nonsense. It looks like a great idea, but the United Nations, the EU, and the United States go inside the project and they destroy it. It's like the Lake Chad project. You know, everybody in Europe say it's impossible. So instead of doing that, we can do some small projects and take pictures of them and raise money for them in Europe. But that's really what happens. The problem is that we have a policy in Europe and the United States right now, which has to be changed, is that destroying these great ideas. I was in a water conference, which also this is another thing which should be destroyed, is this environmentalist madness, a Malthusian idea, a water conference, how to solve the water crisis in the world. So I went there with the hope that, here are experts who want to discuss. And I went through all the papers by European and American scientists, so-called. The only thing they want to talk about is that you cannot solve the water crisis because we have population growth and we have nations who want to give their people a better living standard. And this is the biggest crisis. People want to have a better life. That's what the real problem is. You cannot solve the water crisis. You can only manage the crisis. You manage scarcity by saving water, by putting a price on water. So those who cannot afford the water, they don't have the water. So their idea is that, okay, we are all going to die, but with our Malthusian policy, we can die slowly. But we are all going to die of thirst. This is exactly, I wrote a report about that. I quoted them, all these so-called scientists from Germany, from Britain, from the United States. But then you look at the Africans and Asians who are in the conference, everybody's coming there with the Millennium Dam, talk to people from the Nile Basin initiative. They have enormous visions. They want to build things. You know, this is how America and the United States were developed. But then you go to the other side and everyone say, oh, these are crazy Don Quixotean projects. You know, this is idealism. And they try to sabotage them. So it's a bit tragic, but we have these two elements that have to be crushed in Europe and the United States, this geopolitical warmongering, but also this environmentalist insanity. And that's why, because when you look at these regions, people in that region, you have engineers, you have, political leaders who have visions, who want to build things. They know how to deal with the plans there. The problem is that there is not a world policy, a just world policy to implement these projects. Because these projects, they exist. These are not difficult, and they don't cost so much. They don't cost anything, as Ayman said. But there's an intention not to implement these policies and to kill people. That's what people have to realize. But it's camouflaged as scientific research or scientific theories, like Malthus' ideas. So these are two things which have to be dealt with very viciously here in Europe and in the United States.